Preface. I'm going to start by saying the thing that no one says to men like us, and I want you to hear it before anything else in this book, because everything else depends on you believing that I actually mean it. You do not need a good reason to stop. You don't have to have arrived here from strength. You don't have to be a monk with a calling, or a philosopher who reasoned his way out, or one of those serene men in documentaries who gave up desire from a position of abundance and speaks about it in a low voice. You are allowed to be here because it hurt too much. You are allowed to be walking away from something that kept cutting you. That is a legitimate door into this life. It is the door most men actually come through, and I am not going to stand in it and interrogate you before I let you pass. I came through that door myself. There's a genre of advice that would have you believe renunciation only counts if your motives are noble, that if you're leaving because you were rejected, you're a fraud, and your celibacy is just sour grapes with a robe on. I've read a lot of that. I've been told a version of it to my face, and I want to tell you what I know now, after living this. The men who wrote those rules were describing a fantasy. Go and read the actual histories of the monasteries, the real ones, not the brochure, and you'll find they were full of men who arrived wrecked. Men who had lost, who had been humiliated, who couldn't survive the world outside, and came in the gate carrying grief they never fully explained. The tradition took them in. It didn't audit their motives at the door, and a remarkable number of them found something on the inside that the men with noble reasons never found, which is peace. So let's dispense with the entrance exam. Your reason is your reason. The path doesn't care. Now let me tell you plainly what this book is and what it isn't, so you know what you're holding. It is a practical manual for taking sexual desire out of the center of your life and, over time, out of the running of it. Not managed, not moderated. Removed as a governing force. That is a real, achievable, thoroughly documented thing that men have done deliberately for at least 3,000 years. And it works. Not by white-knuckling, which fails for everyone, but by a set of mechanisms I'm going to teach you in detail. You'll get the machinery of wanting, what desire actually is in a male nervous system, and why it regenerates faster than you can feed it. You'll get the extinction protocol, the real method by which attraction loses its grip, which is starvation of cues and non-reinforcement, not war. You'll get what the renunciate traditions knew, with their failures included. The withdrawal, honestly described. Where the energy goes, what happens to your body, what to tell your family, and a program at the end. 90 days written out, a year mapped. Now the corrections, both of them, and then we begin. The first is about the word. When I started, I told people I was becoming asexual, and I was wrong, and being wrong cost me a year of feeling like a failure. Asexuality is an orientation. About 1 person in 100 is simply born not experiencing sexual attraction, the way people are born left-handed. It isn't earned, and there's no protocol that installs it. For a long time I read that fact as a door slamming. If I can't become that, then I'm stuck being this forever. That was the wrong reading, and the right one is the most hopeful thing in this book. You can't change your orientation. But attraction is not one thing. It's an orientation plus a vast superstructure of conditioning, habit, attention, and reward that got built on top of it over 20 years. And that superstructure is where nearly all your suffering actually lives. The scanning, the fixation, the compulsion, the way a stranger on a train can hijack an afternoon. All of that is learned. All of it is maintained by daily reinforcement, and all of it can be extinguished. What's left underneath, when the superstructure is gone, is something so quiet that most men who get there describe it as barely being there at all. You will still notice that a woman is beautiful, the way you notice a building is beautiful. It won't cost you anything. It won't take the day. That is what's actually on offer, and if you'd told me at my worst that it was available, I wouldn't have believed you. The second correction is the harder one, and it's the only place in this book where I'm going to tell you no. You said you'd be willing to build hatred, that if it took resenting women to stop wanting them, you'd pay that. I understand exactly why. When something keeps hurting you, the mind reaches for disgust, because disgust is the one emotion that reliably makes us stop approaching things. It's an intelligent instinct. It just doesn't work here, and I'm not refusing you on moral grounds. I'm refusing you on engineering grounds, because it would sabotage the precise outcome you're paying for. Hatred is not the opposite of desire. Indifference is. Hatred is a high arousal state aimed at the object, and it keeps the object bolted to the center of your attention. It just changes the color of the light you see it in. Go and look at the bitterest men on the internet, the ones who've made contempt a full-time occupation, and count how many hours a day they spend thinking about women. It's more than the men chasing them. They didn't escape the fixation, they married it. And it eats them, because contempt is corrosive and it doesn't stay in the box you assign it. It seeps into how you speak to your mother, your sister, the woman at the pharmacy, and eventually into how you regard yourself, because a man who despises half the species is never at ease anywhere. You told me you want to eventually not even be attracted. Then hear this, because it's the central technical claim of the entire book. Attraction dies from starvation, not from war. Everything that gets you the outcome you want runs through indifference, and every hour spent stoking resentment is an hour spent feeding the very fixation you're trying to end. So there's no hatred chapter here. In its place is the extinction protocol, which is what actually produces the state you're describing, and I'll give it to you in full. And one last honest note, because I'd rather be trusted than believed. You told me about the gray, 20 years of it. I've written a chapter about that later on, and I'll say the short version here so nothing in this book quietly oversells itself. Walking away from the chase will take a real and specific pain out of your life, the sharp recurring one, the one with a name and a date attached. I know that pain and this path genuinely ends it, but the gray is a different machine, and celibacy is not a treatment for it. If this book let you believe otherwise, it would be lying to you in a way that costs you years, and I won't do that. Take the relief this offers. Get the other thing looked at properly, when you can. That's the whole contract. No entrance exam, no noble reasons required, no hatred, no overselling. Let's start with the bill, what the wanting has actually cost. I'll go first. Chapter 1. The Hunger That Ran My Life. I did the arithmetic on a Sunday afternoon in my 34th year at a kitchen table with a pen, because I'd read somewhere that addicts should count and I wanted to prove I wasn't one. I should tell you the state I was in when I picked up that pen, so you don't picture a calm man conducting an audit. I'd been turned down again the week before, not dramatically, just the ordinary modern way, a conversation that thinned out and stopped, and it had put me somewhere I'd been going for years, a flat gray room where nothing was exactly agony and nothing was worth doing. I wasn't counting because I was strong. I was counting because I was tired in a way that sleep doesn't touch, and because some part of me suspected that if I could just see the number, I'd stop being able to pretend. I was right about that. Here's the number. I started with hours, not the sex. That turned out to be almost nothing, a rounding error, which was the first surprise. I counted the surrounding activity, the scrolling, the messaging, the rereading of messages. The app installed, deleted, reinstalled. The porn, honestly, not the flattering estimate. The evenings arranged around a maybe. The commutes spent composing sentences to women who never got them. The rehearsals in the shower. The 2 hours after a rejection, when I was technically present at my own life, and actually somewhere else entirely. I was conservative. I rounded down. And when I finished, the number I had was something like 2 to 3 hours a day, most days, for 15 years. Sit with the shape of that. Call it 2.5. Round the years to 15. That's roughly 13,000 hours. A man becomes fluent in a hard language in about 2,000. A surgeon becomes competent in 10. I could have been a musician, twice. I could have built the business I talked about at every dinner for a decade. Instead, I had bought, and I want to be precise, because precision is what finally moved me, a large quantity of anticipation, a smaller quantity of sex, and an enormous unbroken continuity of low-grade wanting that never once resolved into anything I could hold. That was the second surprise, and it's the one this chapter exists to deliver. The hunger was never satisfied by being fed. Not once. Not ever. Every single time it was fed, it went quiet for a few hours and then stood back up and asked for the next thing. And I had spent 15 years treating each new hunger as a fresh problem, with a fresh solution, rather than noticing that the mechanism itself was the problem. I wasn't pursuing women. I was feeding an appetite that produced more appetite. I was in a relationship with wanting, and the women were incidental, which, when I finally understood it, was the most humiliating thing I have ever understood about myself. Let me show you what the life actually looked like, because the numbers are abstract and the days weren't. It started when I opened my eyes. Not metaphorically. Literally, before I was properly awake, my hand had already found the phone, and the first thing that entered my mind on any given day was a check. Had anyone replied? Nobody had usually replied. The day started with a small deflation before coffee, every day, for years. Then the scanning. I want to name this one carefully, because most men don't know they're doing it. Everywhere I went, all day, some subroutine in me was appraising. The train, the office, the queue at the pharmacy, the woman crossing at the lights. Not lust exactly. It was too automatic to be that interesting. It was more like a background process, permanently running, consuming a slice of every room I ever walked into. I once sat through the entirety of a friend's father's funeral running that process, and caught myself doing it during the eulogy, and felt something cold go through me. That was the first crack in the story I told about myself, not a man with a healthy appetite. A man with a process running that didn't check with him first. Then the evenings. The evenings are where the years actually went. I would come home with a plan. The guitar, the course, the book, the business. And instead, I would open the glowing rectangle, and something would take the wheel. And at 1 a.m, I would surface, hollowed out, having consumed an amount of pornography I'd have lied about to a doctor, or having sent 3 messages to a woman I did not particularly like, and then watched for the reply like a man waiting for a jury. And in the morning I would tell myself that tonight I would do the thing. And that went on, in an unbroken chain, for a decade and a half. Here's what haunts me most, though, and I want to say it plainly because it's the reason I eventually walked out rather than moderating. The wins were worse than the losses. That sounds like something a bitter man says. It isn't. I mean it mechanically. When the chase failed, I suffered for an evening and recovered. When it succeeded, when I actually got the thing, I would lie there afterward in a silence I can still feel, next to a woman whose name I sometimes had to be careful about, and feel the hunger stand up in the dark and start looking around the room for what was next. It hadn't been satisfied. It had been briefly distracted, and now it was back, and the fact that I had just done the thing that was supposed to fix it, and it was already asking again, that was the moment, over and over across many years, when I understood that I was not going to be able to arrive anywhere by walking in this direction. There's no arrival. That's the whole finding. It isn't that the chase is hard or that I was bad at it. By my mid-30s, I was fine at it, which is exactly what made it undeniable. It's that the thing has no floor. You cannot eat your way out of hunger that regenerates faster than you can consume it. Men who are richer than me and better looking than me have proven this exhaustively and publicly, with more women in a month than I had in a decade, and they will tell you, when they're honest, that at the top of that ladder, there is only more ladder. Now, I could have written you a different book, the moderate one. Balance, they call it, the healthy relationship with your appetites, the good middle path, the mature integration. I tried it. I tried it for 3 years, and I want to tell you exactly how it goes, because you'll try it too before you're done. Moderation with a thing that reorganizes your brain around it is a negotiation with a party that lies. Every rule I set, only weekends, only after work, only with someone I actually like, never before noon, was honored for a period and then quietly renegotiated by a version of me who arrived at 11 at night with excellent arguments. The rules didn't fail because I was weak. They failed because a rule is a fence, and the thing I was fencing had unlimited time to look for the gap, and I only had to fall asleep once. And here's the last thing on the bill, the item I didn't want to write down at the kitchen table. It wasn't just hours, and it wasn't just dignity. It was attention, the actual raw material that a life gets built out of. 15 years of it spent. I couldn't read a book without checking. I couldn't sit with a friend without a slice of me elsewhere. I couldn't be in a room, fully as a whole man. Whatever I was never entirely present anywhere, because a percentage of me was always out scanning, hoping, waiting for a reply from someone. That's the real cost, and it's the one that finally did it. Not that I was unhappy. I was mostly fine. That's the trap. But that I was never entirely here. So I put the pen down, and I sat in that kitchen, and I thought a thought that I want you to try on. What would be left of my life if I simply took the whole apparatus out? Not managed it. Removed it. What would the mornings be? What would the evenings hold? What would a man do with 2.5 hours a day and a mind that wasn't scanning? I didn't know. That not knowing is where this book comes from. And I want to be honest about what I felt at that table, because it wasn't resolve. It was something closer to surrender, the specific exhaustion of a man who has tried for a very long time and would like to put the thing down now. If you're waiting to feel strong before you start, you'll wait forever. I started from the floor, which brings us to the objection you're going to hear from every quarter the moment you tell anyone what you're doing, that a man who quits after being hurt hasn't really quit. He's just given up. I've heard it. You'll hear it. Let's deal with it properly in the next chapter. Because it's wrong, and being able to see exactly why it's wrong is what will keep you standing in year 2. Chapter 2. You don't need a noble reason. There's a sentence waiting for you. You'll meet it the first time you tell a friend, or a brother, or anyone who thinks they know you, and it will be delivered kindly, which makes it worse. It goes like this. You're not really choosing this. You're just running away. I want to spend this chapter dismantling that sentence thoroughly, because it is the single most common thing that drags men back into a game they'd successfully left. Not desire, not loneliness, that sentence. It works by installing a splinter of doubt about your own legitimacy. And a man who doubts his own legitimacy will eventually re-enter the arena just to prove he could have stayed. And he re-enters it worse than he left, because now he's performing. So let's take it apart. The first thing to see is that the sentence contains a hidden premise, and the premise is false. It assumes that a decision's validity depends on the emotional state of the man making it, that a choice made from pain is somehow less real than a choice made from serenity. Apply that standard anywhere else in life and watch it collapse instantly. A man quits drinking after his hands shake at a wedding. Is he a fraud because he waited until it hurt? A man leaves a job after the third humiliation in a month. Did he need to leave from a position of calm abundance for the resignation to count? Nobody has ever said this. In every other domain, we understand that pain is information, that it is, in fact, the primary way human beings learn anything, and that acting on it is not weakness. It's the entire function of having a nervous system. It is only in this one subject, sex, that men are told their withdrawal is illegitimate unless they can prove they weren't hurting. The second thing to see is who benefits from that rule. A man who believes he needs noble reasons will stay in the game indefinitely, because noble reasons don't arrive. Serenity is not the starting condition of a decision like this. It's a downstream consequence of having made it. If you wait to feel peaceful about women before you step back from them, you will wait until you are 70, still checking your phone. Third, and this is the part one most want to give you, because it took me 2 years and a lot of reading to find it. The historical record is on your side. Overwhelmingly, and almost nobody knows it, we have a romantic picture of the renunciate, a man of unusual spiritual gifts who set down his desires from a great height out of pure devotion. Go into the actual sources, and that man is rare. The desert fathers of the 3rd and 4th centuries, the men who essentially invented Christian monasticism in the Egyptian wilderness, left behind their own sayings, and what comes through is not serenity. It's men wrestling, men who fled cities where they'd failed, men tormented by memories, men who wrote frankly about lust arriving in waves for decades. One of the most quoted lines in that whole literature is a monk asking an elder whether he should give up, having fallen again, and being told to get up again, and asking how many times, and being told, until you die. That's not a tradition of untroubled men. That's a hospital, and it knew it was a hospital. The old texts even used the word. They called the monastery an infirmary for souls, and they were not being poetic. Read the Buddhist material, and you find the same thing. The early sangha filled up with people arriving in every possible condition: the bereaved, the ruined, the socially disgraced, men who had failed at ordinary life, and women who had lost everything. One of the most famous stories in the entire tradition is a woman who arrived out of her mind with grief carrying a dead child. Nobody sent her away for having impure motives. The teaching met her exactly where she stood. And the whole Stoic project, Epictetus was a slave with a ruined leg. Marcus Aurelius wrote his private notes to keep himself upright in the middle of plague, war, and a life he didn't much enjoy. These are not men writing from abundance. They're men building something because they needed it to survive the day. Here's the pattern that runs through every one of these traditions, and it is the exact opposite of the folk wisdom you've been handed. People arrive broken, and the practice does the rest. The motive at the door turns out to be nearly irrelevant to the outcome. What matters is what you actually do after you walk in. Now let me give you something more precise, because I don't want to just reassure you. I want to hand you something true that will hold weight. Motives are not fixed objects. This is the thing nobody tells you. The reason you begin something is almost never the reason you continue it, because the reason converts as you go. I began this because I was tired of being hurt. Straightforwardly. If you'd had me on a lie detector in that first month, I'd have told you I was hiding, and I'd have been telling the truth. But somewhere in the second year, I noticed that the reason had quietly changed underneath me. I wasn't staying out because it was safe anymore. I was staying out because I had gotten used to owning my own attention, and the thought of handing it back had become genuinely unattractive. Not frightening. Unattractive. Like being offered a job I'd already quit. Nobody talked me into that. No amount of purity of motive at the start would have produced it faster. It came from time and practice, and it would have come exactly the same way if I had started for the worst reasons imaginable. So here's the reframe I want you to carry, and it's the whole chapter in one line. Your reason for starting is a door, not a foundation. Doors are how you get in. Nobody lives in the doorway. What holds the building up is what you build after you're inside, and that construction doesn't care which door you came through. One more thing, and then we go to the machinery. There will be a version of that sentence you hear in your own voice at 2 a.m, and it will be more persuasive than anything a friend says. This is just cope. You're only doing this because you couldn't get what you wanted. Answer it once, properly, and then don't relitigate it. Here's the answer. Suppose it's entirely true. Suppose you're here purely because it hurt too much, with no nobility in it whatsoever. So what? The hours are still yours. The scanning still stops. The 2 a.m. still gets quiet. The evenings still come back. Every single benefit in this book is a physical, structural change in how your days are spent, and not one of them checks your paperwork on the way in. A man who stops drinking gets his liver back, regardless of whether he stopped for beautiful reasons. The liver doesn't know. You are not required to be a hero about this. You're required to do it, and doing it is enough. Now, the reason you can't simply decide this and be done, because you've decided before, probably many times, and it didn't hold, and that failure was not a failure of character. It was a failure of method, and to fix the method we need to look at what desire actually is inside a male nervous system. Chapter 3. The Machinery of Wanting. You have decided to stop before. Probably dozens of times. Sunday night with real conviction, meaning every word of it. And by Thursday, you were back. And the gap between the conviction and the collapse is where men lose their self-respect. I need you to understand something before we go one step further. That gap is not a moral failing. It's a design feature of the machine you're operating. And once you can see the machine, the failures stop being mysterious and start being solvable. This chapter is the schematic. It's the most technical chapter in the book, and the one everything practical later depends on, so I'm going to build it carefully. Start with the single, most useful thing neuroscience has discovered about desire, because it corrects the mistake at the root of every failed attempt. Wanting and liking are two different systems. For most of the last century, dopamine was described as the pleasure chemical. That turned out to be wrong, and the correction is enormously important for you. Work by researchers like Kent Berridge showed that you can strip the dopamine system out of an animal almost entirely, and the animal still enjoys things. The pleasure reactions are intact, but it stops pursuing them. It'll starve in front of food it likes. Flip it the other way, and you can drive wanting up while liking stays flat. Two separate circuits. one that generates craving and pursuit, one that generates enjoyment. And here's the punchline that explains your entire adult life. They can come apart completely. You can end up wanting something enormously that you barely enjoy at all when you get it. Read that again, because it is your experience, described mechanically. The scrolling you don't enjoy, the porn session that ends in something closer to disgust than satisfaction. The pursuit of a woman you didn't even particularly like. That's not perversity. That's a wanting circuit running at full power with the liking circuit disconnected. And it means the strategy of getting it out of my system is structurally impossible because the system you're trying to empty isn't the one that gets filled. Now, the second mechanism, which explains why it never stops. Dopamine is not a reward signal, it's a prediction signal. Wolfram Schultz's work with monkeys established this, and it holds up everywhere. When a reward is genuinely unexpected, dopamine fires at the reward. Once a cue reliably predicts it, the firing moves backward in time onto the cue, and when the reward arrives exactly as predicted, there's barely a blip. The chemistry lives in the anticipation, not in the having. This is the whole tragedy of the chase in one sentence. The moment of maximum activation is the notification, the maybe, the unread message, the possibility, not the event. Which is why the events were always so strangely hollow, and why the hollowness never taught you anything. Your machine was never trying to get you to a destination. It was trying to keep you in motion. Third, the schedule. The most addictive reinforcement pattern ever identified isn't reliable reward, it's unpredictable reward. Skinner's variable ratio, the principle every slot machine and every social feed is built on. Reward that comes sometimes, unpredictably, produces the most persistent behavior in the animal kingdom and the most resistant to extinction. Now look at your last 15 years. Did women respond reliably? No, sometimes. Occasionally. Unpredictably. Did the app produce a match on a schedule? No. Randomly, rarely, thrillingly. You weren't in a courtship system. You were in a slot machine that occasionally paid in human beings, and your persistence in the face of overwhelming losses isn't evidence that you're pathetic. It's evidence that the schedule works exactly as designed. Pigeons do the same thing. So do neurosurgeons. Fourth, and this one matters especially for the extinction work later, conditioning. Pavlov's finding wasn't really about dogs and bells. It was that any neutral cue, paired repeatedly with a reward, becomes a trigger that produces the craving state by itself. Over 20 years, you have built an enormous private lattice of these. The unlocking of the phone, the particular hour of the evening, the sound of a notification, sitting down in that chair, Sunday afternoons, certain music, loneliness itself. If you've reliably answered loneliness with the same behavior, none of these are sexual. All of them now produce the state because you trained them to, thousands of repetitions deep, with a variable ratio payout, which is to say you built the most durable conditioning structure known to behavioral science by accident in your own head. Fifth, supernormal stimuli. Nico Tinbergen found that animals presented with exaggerated versions of a natural cue respond more strongly to the fake than the real thing. Birds abandoning their own eggs to sit on giant plaster ones, males attempting to mate with a crude model that had the key features amplified. Modern pornography is the most refined supernormal stimulus ever constructed. Unlimited novelty, no cost, no rejection, no negotiation. engineered by an industry with feedback data on billions of sessions. Anything real must compete with that, and it can't, and this is precisely why the men deepest into it often report the least interest in actual women. The lattice has been trained on something that doesn't exist. And sixth, the one that explains why abstinence sometimes gets harder before it gets easier. Incubation. When you cut off a well-established conditioned behavior, cue-triggered craving does not decline smoothly from day one. In the research on drug cue reactivity, it often climbs for a period after cessation before it falls. Practically, the surge you feel in the second or third week is not evidence that the method is failing. It's a known shape. Men quit right there, at the exact moment the curve is about to turn, because nobody told them the curve exists. Now put the whole machine together and look at what you've actually been fighting. A wanting circuit that operates independently of enjoyment, so satisfaction can't switch it off. A prediction system that loads all its charge onto anticipation, so the pursuit is the drug. A variable ratio schedule that makes the behavior maximally persistent. A lattice of dozens of conditioned cues woven through your ordinary day, so the state gets triggered without any decision from you. A supernormal stimulus that has recalibrated the whole system away from reality. And a craving curve that rises after you quit. Against all of that, you brought willpower, a Sunday night resolution, conscious intention, sustained by a system that gets tired, in a body that is being cued dozens of times a day by things you never even identified as cues. Of course it failed. It was never a fair fight. And the fact that you blamed your character for losing it is the cruelest part of the whole arrangement. But now look at the same schematic from the other direction, because everything I just described is also a list of exploitable weaknesses, and this is where the hope in this book actually comes from. Conditioned associations are learned, which means they extinguish when the cue stops being followed by the reward. That's not a theory, it's one of the most reliable findings in behavioral science. The cue lattice can be dismantled directly by removing cues from your environment. No willpower required, because a trigger you never encounter fires 0 times. The supernormal stimulus can be withdrawn, and sensitivity to ordinary reality returns over months. The prediction system, starved of maybes, quiets down. And the craving curve, past its incubation hump, genuinely declines. That's why the men who make it through the first months describe something the men in week 2 cannot imagine. Not a fight they're winning, but an absence of a fight. That's the real target, not a stronger man resisting harder, a quieter machine with fewer triggers. Which brings us to the thing you actually ask for. A state where you're simply not attracted anymore, where it doesn't take effort because there's nothing pulling. That state is reachable, it has a mechanism, and it is not achieved by force or by turning the wanting into hatred. It's achieved by extinction, and extinction has rules. That's the next chapter, and it's the heart of this book. Chapter 4. Why hatred is the wrong tool. I want to take this seriously rather than piously, because the instinct behind it is intelligent, and I had it too. The reasoning goes like this. Desire keeps pulling me toward a thing that keeps hurting me. Disgust is the one emotion that reliably makes a human being stop approaching something. Therefore, if I can make myself find women repellent, if I can build up enough resentment, enough contempt, enough accumulated evidence of their cruelty, the pull will stop, and I'll be free. It's not stupid. It's an attempt at aversive conditioning. And aversive conditioning is a real thing that works in some contexts. A man who gets violently ill from a particular food will often lose his appetite for it permanently. So let me tell you precisely why it doesn't work here, in mechanical terms, and then tell you what it does instead, because I've watched it happen to men I knew. The first problem is the one I named in the preface, and it's fatal on its own. Hatred is a high arousal state directed at an object, and any high arousal state directed at an object keeps that object at the center of your attention. Look at what you're actually trying to achieve. You want women to stop occupying your mind. Contempt doesn't evacuate the mind. It furnishes it. The man who despises women is thinking about women. He's thinking about them while he reads, while he drives, while he watches a film he chose because of a comment section. He has arguments with them in his head. He notices every one of them in the street, now with a spike of something hot instead of something warm, but noticing all the same, and noticing is the enemy. He has not reduced his consumption of women by a single hour. He's changed the flavor and kept the volume, and the volume was the problem. Go and look if you doubt me. Spend 20 minutes in the bitterest corners of the internet, the ones built entirely on resentment, and count the subject matter. Nearly every post is about women. Their psychology, their choices, their supposed nature, endlessly relitigated. Those men have organized their entire identity around the thing they claim to have rejected. That is not escape. That's the same prison with the walls repainted, and it holds men for decades. I've watched it hold men for decades, men who at 19 were simply hurt, and at 40 are still furious about it, having spent 21 years on a subject they'd sworn off. The second problem is that resentment doesn't stay where you put it. Men imagine emotions are stored in labeled boxes. This contempt is only for the women who rejected me. It won't touch anything else. That isn't how a nervous system works. Cultivated contempt generalizes, and it generalizes fastest along the lines you rehearse. It gets into your voice with your mother. It comes out sideways in how you talk to a colleague, a nurse, a cashier, and people register it long before you do. It shows up in what you find funny. And then it comes home, because a mind practiced in contempt does not maintain a special exemption for its owner. It turns that same lens inward at 3 in the morning, and the man who has spent a year rehearsing disgust discovers he's fluent in it about himself. Bitterness is not a filter you install on one window. It's a tint that goes into the glass. The third problem is that it's fragile, in an unexpected way. Aversion built on grievance requires maintenance. You have to keep feeding it evidence, which means seeking out material that keeps you angry. So the man on this path has to consume women constantly in order to keep hating them, which is an absurd and exhausting position. And the whole structure inverts on contact with one kind woman. I've seen it. A man with 2 years of accumulated theory about the nature of women receives one afternoon of genuine warmth from one of them, and the entire edifice comes down in a week. And because he built his stability on the wall rather than on his own ground, he falls further than he ever was before, straight back into the chase, hungrier than when he left, and now humiliated on top of it. Aversion is a wall. Walls fail catastrophically. What you want is not a wall. Now let me give you the thing itself, the distinction that took me longest to feel rather than just understand. Hatred is not the opposite of desire. They are the same underlying orientation, intense attention paid to a category of person, with a strong emotional charge, with your inner state dependent on them. Flipping the sign from plus to minus changes nothing structural. If a woman's warmth can make your day and a woman's coldness can ruin it, you're owned in both directions. The genuine opposite of desire is indifference. Low arousal, low attention, no charge. Not, I have decided she is worthless. Just. Nothing much happened when she walked past, and I noticed it the way I notice a car. That state is real. I'm in it most days now. It is unspectacular in a way that surprised me. I expected freedom to feel like a triumph, and instead it feels like a room being quiet after a machine you'd stopped hearing finally switches off. And here's the thing I most want you to have. I did not get there by winning a war against attraction. I got there by starving it. Every mechanism in the next chapter is a starvation mechanism. None of them require you to think a single bad thought about anybody. And there's a practical bonus that matters more than it sounds. Indifference is invisible. Contempt is loud. The man running on resentment is legible to everyone around him. It's in his jokes, his tone, his face, and it makes him unpleasant to be near, which costs him friendships, work, and family at exactly the time in his life when he can least afford to lose people. The man running on indifference just seems calm. Nobody interrogates a calm man. You'll find, when we get to the social chapter, that this is the difference between a path you can actually live in public and one that isolates you further every year. Let me also say plainly what I am not asking of you, so this doesn't get heard as a demand for sainthood. I'm not asking you to feel warm toward women. I'm not asking you to forgive anyone or process anything, or arrive at some generous conclusion about the people who hurt you. You are allowed to be angry. Anger about real injuries is legitimate, and it doesn't have to be resolved before you can start. The practice works fine with unfinished business in the background. What I'm telling you is narrower and purely tactical. Don't cultivate it. Don't feed it. Don't rehearse it. Don't build an identity around it. Don't go looking for material that keeps it lit. Let it be what it is and let it cool on its own, which it will, because emotions that aren't being fed lose their charge. That's the same extinction principle, applied to resentment instead of desire. The men who stay bitter for decades are not men who were hurt worse. They're men who kept the wound fed. There's one more reason, and it's the one that finally settled it for me, though I'll only spend a paragraph on it because you didn't ask for philosophy. Contempt makes you smaller, not morally, experientially. It narrows what you can see, it makes you tedious, it removes your ability to be surprised by people, and it puts a permanent low-grade tension in your body that you'll mistake for alertness. Whatever else this path is for, it should make your interior life more habitable than it was, because you're going to be spending a lot of time in there. A man who has quit the chase and gained a quiet mind has made an extraordinary trade. A man who has quit the chase and gained an enemy has just swapped one occupation for another, and the new one pays worse. So, no war. Starvation, which is a method, not a slogan, and it has specific rules. What to remove, in what order, what happens when the craving spikes anyway, and why the thing you do in the 90 seconds after a cue fires matters more than anything you believe. That's next. And it's the mechanism that actually delivers what you ask me for. Chapter 5. The Extinction Protocol. This is the chapter that does the work. Everything before it was diagnosis. Everything after it is support and detail. If you only ever practice one thing from this book, practice what's in here, because this is the actual mechanism by which a man stops being pulled. Not by resisting the pull, but by dismantling the apparatus that generates it. Let me state the principle first, in one sentence, and then spend the chapter making it operational. A conditioned response weakens when the cue stops being followed by the reward. That's extinction. It is one of the most robust findings in behavioral science. It works in every species that has been tested, and it is working on you right now in a direction you didn't choose. Your desire is not a fixed quantity of fuel in a tank. It is a trained response, maintained daily by a specific set of cues and payoffs, and it has to be fed continuously to stay at its current strength. Stop the feeding and it declines, not because you're strong, because that's what untrained responses do. 5 rules. In order. Rule 1, remove the cue, don't resist it. This is the most important sentence in the book. There's a study on self-control that reorganized how I think about all of this. When researchers looked at people who scored highest on trait self-control, they expected to find heroic resistors, people winning more internal battles. They found the opposite. High self-control people report fewer temptations, not more victories. They've arranged their lives so the fight rarely starts. Their advantage is structural, not moral. Apply that here, and the entire strategy inverts. You have been trying to get better at saying no at 11 at night. That is the hardest possible place to fight, against a cued craving, with a tired brain, alone, with the object one tap away. You will lose that fight, often enough that the losses define your self-image. So stop fighting it there. Fight it at 9 in the morning in an unaroused state with a screwdriver by removing the thing that fires the cue in the first place. A trigger you do not encounter fires 0 times, and 0 requires no willpower at all. Concretely, and this is the first week of the program, the phone does not come into the bedroom, not on the far side of the room. Out. Buy a physical alarm clock. It costs almost nothing, and it is the highest leverage purchase in this entire book. Every app, whose primary content is women, goes off the device tonight, including the ones you tell yourself are for other purposes. The feeds get cut off at the source. Unfollow, mute, block, aggressively, without sentimentality, until your scroll is genuinely free of the material. If the algorithm keeps serving it, the account goes. Content blockers on the browser, at the network level if you can, configured while you're calm and with the password somewhere inconvenient. This is not moralism about pornography. It's the removal of a supernormal stimulus that has been recalibrating your entire reward system, and it is non-negotiable if you want the rest to work. And then the ones nobody thinks of, the situational cues, the particular chair, the specific hour of empty evening, the route home past a certain place, boredom, which for you is not a mood but a trigger, loneliness, which you have reliably answered the same way for years. You cannot delete loneliness, but you can pre-commit what follows it, which is Rule 4. Rule 2. Non-reinforcement. When the cue fires anyway, and it will thousands of times, the single thing that matters is that it is not followed by the reward. Every unreinforced cue is a small subtraction from the response. Every reinforced one is a deposit that resets a lot of progress, which is why just this once is so expensive. On a variable schedule, an occasional payout is the most powerful maintenance signal there is. One relapse a month is not 5% of the old behavior. It's an intermittent reinforcement schedule, which is to say the strongest possible arrangement for keeping the response alive forever. This is the mechanical reason moderation fails and complete cessation succeeds, not purity. Arithmetic. Rule 3. Understand what a craving actually is, physically, so it stops frightening you. A cue-triggered urge is a wave. It rises, peaks, and falls, and for most men, the whole thing runs its course in a few minutes if nothing feeds it. It is not a command, and it is not a state you are stuck in. The technique, and this comes out of addiction work, where it's called urge surfing, is to stop trying to make it go away and instead observe it as a physical event. Where is it in the body? What does it actually feel like? Heat, tightness, restlessness in the hands. Watch it climb. Watch it crest. Watch it go. You'll discover something the first time you do it properly. Nothing was ever going to happen. The urge has no power to move you. It was only ever loud. Two things sabotage this. Thought suppression, trying not to think about it, reliably backfires. Daniel Wegner's work on that is famous for a reason, and every man who has tried to white-knuckle knows the effect from the inside. And engagement with the content of the craving, the negotiating, the, well, maybe just, which is the mind-generating persuasive material because it is very good at that. You are not obliged to argue. You just have to let the wave pass while doing something else with your hands. Rule 4, replacement. This is where most men fail, and it's entirely predictable. A behavior serves a function, and if you remove it without providing another route to the function, the pressure will find its way back to the old channel. What was the wanting actually doing for you? For most of us, several jobs. It filled empty evenings. It discharged stress. It medicated loneliness. It provided a reliable hit of anticipation in a life short on things to look forward to. Take it out, and those functions are now unmet at the same times of day with the same intensity. So you pre-decide the replacements in advance, in writing, matched to the trigger. Not vague intentions. Implementation intentions. The if-then structure that Peter Gallwitzer's research shows outperforms goal setting by a wide margin because it removes the decision from the moment of weakness. If it's 11 at night and I'm reaching, then I put on shoes and walk for 15 minutes. If the restlessness hits after work, then it's the gym bag that's already packed by the door. If I'm lonely, then I call one of 3 specific names on a list I wrote when I was calm. Physical, immediate, and decided beforehand. The list goes on paper. Paper doesn't have a browser. Rule 5, expect the curve and know its shape, because ignorance of the shape is what kills men in week 3. Cravings do not decline in a straight line from day 1. They typically get worse before they get better, the incubation effect from the last chapter, and then they decline unevenly, with spikes triggered by stress, alcohol, poor sleep, and by encountering old cues. Extinguished responses can also come back spontaneously after a period of quiet, and they can be reinstated by a single exposure or by returning to an old context. None of that means failure. It means you're a normal mammal with a normal learning system, and the men who make it are simply the ones who were told in advance that the curve looks like this. Now let me give you the honest calibration, because I won't sell you a timeline I didn't get. The first 2 weeks are removal and noise. Weeks 2 to 6 are usually the worst, the incubation hump, plus the flatness we'll cover in the withdrawal chapter. Somewhere in months 2 and 3, most men report the first genuinely quiet stretch, and it's disorienting. You notice an evening went by without the subject arising at all. 6 months to a year is where the scanning habit, the automatic appraisal of every woman in every room, noticeably thins out, and that's the one you care most about, because that's the one that costs you the day. Past a year, it keeps going down. I won't tell you it hits 0, because for me it hasn't. What I can tell you is that what remains is so quiet and so cheap that it doesn't organize anything. It's a passing observation, like noticing the weather. That's the honest version of what you asked me for. Not a switch that turns you into someone who was born without this. A trained response, starved of its inputs, declining year over year until it stops running your life. That is achievable, the mechanism is known, and none of it requires you to hate anyone. Now, the men who did this before us, without a word of neuroscience between them, worked most of it out anyway, and they also made mistakes that cost them badly. It's worth knowing both. Chapter 6. What the renunciates knew. You are not doing something new. That's worth sitting with, because one of the loneliest parts of this path in the modern world is the sense that you're inventing a deformity. You aren't. You are joining something old and enormous. A line of men in every civilization that ever produced written records who looked at sexual desire, decided it was costing more than it returned, and stepped out. Some of them left instructions. The instructions are worth reading, because they had no neuroscience and still worked out, empirically, over centuries, most of what the last chapter told you. They also got things badly wrong, and some of those errors did real damage. I'm going to give you both, because a man who takes the tradition uncritically inherits the damage along with the wisdom. Start in the Egyptian desert, 3rd and 4th centuries. Men walked out of the cities into the wilderness and invented what became Christian monasticism, and, unusually for ancient movements, they left behind their own plain-spoken sayings, rather than a polished theology. What strikes you reading them is how practical and unromantic they are. They understood cue removal. The whole logic of going to the desert was that a man cannot be triggered by what is not there, which is Rule 1, arrived at 1700 years early. They understood that idleness was the enemy. The instruction to stay at manual work was constant, and the reason given was explicitly that an unoccupied man is prey to whatever arrives. They understood the wave. Their advice on the arrival of lust was to not argue with the thought, not to entertain it and negotiate, but to let it pass while occupying yourself. That is urge surfing, with different vocabulary. And they understood the failure curve. The famous exchange about falling and getting up, and how many times, and the answer being until you die, is a tradition telling its members in advance that relapse is expected and does not disqualify you. They were far more honest about that than most modern self-improvement is. Move east. The Buddhist monastic project came at it from a different angle. Not sin, but suffering. The claim wasn't that desire is dirty. It was that craving is the mechanism that produces dissatisfaction, and that the pursuit of it can never terminate in peace, because the wanting regenerates. That is precisely the finding you reached at your own kitchen table when you noticed that satisfaction never once switched the hunger off. They also built something the Desert Fathers didn't emphasize as much, and which I want you to take seriously. They didn't treat renunciation as deprivation. They treated it as the removal of a burden. And the texts are full of language about lightness, about a load being set down. That framing does real work. A man who experiences this as a life of not having will not last. A man who experiences it as a life without a particular weight will. Go to India and you find brahmacharya, the most systematized version. Continence. There was one part of a whole regimen. Diet, sleep, posture, breath, the company you keep, what you look at, which is to say they understood something modern men consistently miss. This is not a single act of abstention. It's an ecology. Everything feeds it, or starves it. They were also, in my reading, the most explicit about redirection. The idea that the energy doesn't simply vanish but must be given somewhere to go. We'll handle that claim carefully later, because the physiology got exaggerated, but the practical instinct is sound. And then the Stoics, who I'd argue are the most useful to a modern secular man, because they weren't renouncing sex for God, they were doing it for sovereignty. Epictetus, born a slave, taught that the whole of freedom consists in wanting only what is up to you, because anything else installs a ruler over you. Apply that to your life, and it's brutal in its clarity. If your day can be made or destroyed by whether a particular person replies to a message, then that person governs you, and no amount of success within that arrangement makes you free. The Stoic move isn't to hate the thing. It's to stop granting it authority. Marcus Aurelius, in his private notes, keeps deliberately deflating sexual thoughts by describing the act in plain physical terms, not out of disgust, but as a technique for stripping the glamour off an object his mind kept inflating. That's cognitive diffusion in a Roman notebook, so that's the inheritance, and there's a great deal in it. Now the failures, because they matter. The first and worst is the sexual shame that came bundled with much of the religious material, the framing of desire as filth and of the self as contaminated. This is not a small quibble. Shame is a poor motivator and a corrosive fuel. It produces cycles of secrecy and collapse, and it has produced enormous suffering. You can take everything useful from these traditions without adopting 1 gram of it. Desire is not evil. It is an expensive drive that you have decided not to run anymore, the way a man might decide to stop keeping horses. No moral verdict is required. The second is enforced celibacy, which is a different animal entirely from chosen celibacy, and the historical record on it is grim. When institutions imposed it on people who had not genuinely chosen it, often young, often with no exit, often with no honest way to discuss failure, the results included concealment, hypocrisy, and in the worst cases, catastrophic abuse. The lesson is directly relevant to you. This only works as a chosen thing with a real exit available. A path you cannot leave is not a discipline, it's a trap, and trapped men do damage. That's why there's an exit clause in the program at the end of this book, and why I distrust any version of this that didn't have one. The third is the physiological mythology, especially in the energy retention traditions. Grand claims got made about vital essence, about the number of drops of blood in a drop of semen, about superhuman capacities unlocked by retention. There's no good evidence for the metaphysics. What is real is much more modest, and I'll cover it properly later. The recovery of enormous amounts of time and attention, the ending of a compulsive cycle, and the ordinary vitality of a man who sleeps well and isn't up until 2. That's plenty. It doesn't need magic, and men who go in expecting magic quit when it doesn't arrive. The fourth is isolation as a default. It worked in the desert because the desert had a community in it. Those men had elders, brothers, a structure, a shared life. The modern imitation is a man alone in an apartment with no one to tell, and that is not the tradition, it's the tradition minus the part that made it survivable. If you take one structural lesson from all of history here, take that one. Every durable version of this life was lived among people. We'll come back to it. Let me close with the thing that made me feel less strange than anything else I read. Across all of these traditions, separated by continents and centuries and irreconcilable beliefs about the universe, the men who went far into this reported the same phenomenon at the far end. Not ecstasy, not superiority, quiet. A word that keeps recurring in translation after translation: stillness, tranquility, peace, used not to describe a spiritual firework, but the ordinary texture of a day that has stopped being pulled at. Independent invention, over and over, is how you know something is actually there. When Egyptian hermits and Indian ascetics and Roman aristocrats and Japanese monks all describe the same destination in the same modest terms, they are not sharing a delusion. They are describing a real state of the human nervous system, available to men who stop feeding a particular fire. You're allowed to want that, and you're allowed to have arrived at wanting it because you were tired, because so did a great many of them. Before we go further into the practice, though, I owe you an honest accounting of what it costs. Every tradition I've just described was clear-eyed about the price. I'd be doing you a disservice if I weren't. Chapter 7. The Costs, Named Honestly. A man who sells you a path without a price is either lying or hasn't walked it. This chapter is the bill. I'd rather you decide with the number in front of you, because a cost you counted in advance is survivable, and a cost that ambushes you at year 2 is what sends men back. The first cost is touch, and it's the one nobody warns you about, because it isn't sex. Human beings are built to be touched. The research on this is not soft. Skin has specialized fibers that respond to slow, gentle contact and route to the parts of the brain that handle emotional well-being. Chronic absence of touch is associated with worse sleep, more anxiety, more physical stress markers. And here's the specific trap for men in our culture. For most men, essentially all of the touch they receive in adulthood arrives through romantic and sexual relationships. Take that channel out, and many men drop to functionally 0 months of no human contact beyond a handshake. That is a real physiological deficit, and it will show up as a diffuse ache you'll misdiagnose as loneliness for the woman you didn't get. It usually isn't. It's your skin. It's also the most fixable cost on this list, and I'll come back to it in the chapter on the body with concrete solutions, because leaving it unsolved is one of the top reasons men break. The second cost is the one nobody says out loud. No one will ever know your interior. Not sex, the byproduct of long partnership. There's a particular kind of being known that comes from years of daily proximity with one person. Someone who can read your face at the door, who knows the story behind the scar, and the reason you hate a certain month. You are trading that away. Friends, even excellent ones, generally don't reach that depth in modern male life, and family knows an older version of you. This is the deepest cost on the list, and I won't pretend it's recoverable. What I'll say honestly is that a great many partnered people don't have it either. Plenty of men are lonelier inside a marriage than I am alone, which is not a consolation so much as a correction to the fantasy you're comparing yourself against. Compare against the real distribution, not the film. The third cost is children, and if there's any part of you that wants them, this is the one to think hardest about, because it has a clock on it, and it is the least reversible thing in this book. Some men feel this strongly at 40, having felt nothing at 30. You are allowed to hold this open. The exit clause in the program exists partly for this, but do not let yourself drift past it unconsidered. Drifting is how men end up with a decision they never actually made. The fourth cost is social friction, and it's constant and low grade rather than dramatic. You will be asked endlessly, at weddings, at family dinners, by well-meaning colleagues who want to set you up. There'll be the assumption that you're closeted, or damaged, or a late bloomer, or lying. In many families, there's genuine pressure with real weight behind it. You'll watch friends pair off and their availability collapse, because that's what happens, and your social world will thin in your 30s and 40s whether or not you take this path. But on this path, you'll have no equivalent institution filling the gap. There's a whole chapter on handling this. It's manageable, it's also permanent, and it's a tax you'll pay in small amounts forever. The fifth cost is the loss of a story. This one surprised me. For 15 years, The Hunger was also a narrative engine, a source of hope, drama, anticipation, the sense that something might happen. When you remove it, you don't just remove the suffering, you remove the plot. There is a specific flatness in the early months that isn't withdrawal exactly. It's the discovery that the wanting was doing more structural work in your life than you realized. It was the thing that made Fridays mean something. If you don't build something else that makes time mean something, that flatness stays, and a man living a flat life will eventually go back for the drama, even though the drama hurt him. That's the bill. Now let me tell you what I actually got, and I'm going to keep it unglamorous because the honest gains are enough. Time, the first and biggest. My 2.5 hours a day came back. Not in a burst. It arrived quietly, in pieces, and the first thing I noticed was that evenings had become long. I'd forgotten evenings were long. Whatever you have wanted to build and never had time for, you now have the time for. And the sole reason you won't do it is if you fail to put something in the vacancy. That's a warning, not a promise. A tension, which is bigger than time and harder to describe. The scanning stopped. I sat through a whole film. I read a book in a chair without the pull to check anything. I had a conversation with a friend where I was entirely present for the whole of it, and afterwards I felt something I couldn't place for a while and eventually identified as rest. That process had been running in the background of every room I entered for 2 decades, and I never knew what it was costing until it stopped. The end of the specific pain. This is the one you came for, and it is real, and I want to be exact about it. The wound of being unwanted requires participation to keep cutting. It needs a message sent, a hope raised, an outcome pending. When you stop entering, that particular pain, the sharp one, the one with a date and a name attached, the one that can take a day, stops occurring. Not managed, not endured better. It stops happening because you remove the mechanism that produced it. Within a few months, I noticed I hadn't had one of those days in a long time. That is what this path pays out, and it pays out reliably. Self-respect of a strange, quiet kind. Not the kind you get from winning. The kind you get from no longer doing a thing at 1 a.m. that you'd be ashamed to describe. 20 years of small private humiliations simply stop accumulating, and the absence of new deposits is its own slow relief. And money, mundanely, the sums that went into the whole apparatus over a decade, which I recommend you also add up, because it's another number that persuades. Now the honest ledger requires one more entry, and I'd be dishonest to leave it out. Some men do this and are lonely. Not all, but some, and the loneliness is real. And I'm not going to tell you it always resolves. The variable that separates them isn't willpower or purity. It's whether they built a human life around the practice or just subtracted sex from an empty one. Every enduring tradition of this put men in community deliberately, and the modern man who tries it alone in an apartment is attempting the hardest version ever devised. If you take one instruction from this whole chapter, subtraction alone is not a life. What you build in the vacancy is the difference between a quiet life and a hollow one. So there's the price, in full, with nothing hidden. Read it twice. If it still looks like a good trade to you, and for me, having lived both sides, it isn't close, then the rest of this book is the how. Starting with the first and hardest 90 days, and what actually happens inside a man's body and mind when the feeding stops. Chapter 8. The Withdrawal. Nobody prepares men for this part, and the lack of preparation is why most attempts die in the first 6 weeks. Not because the difficulty is unbearable. It isn't, but because the difficulty arrives in a shape men don't expect, and an unexpected shape reads as failure. So, this chapter is the map. When you know what's coming, and roughly when, the same experience stops being evidence that you're broken and becomes evidence that you're on schedule. I'll walk it in order, with honest timings, and then give you the specific failure points. The first 3 or 4 days are usually easy, and this is a trap. There's often a lift, clarity, energy, a sense of having taken control at last. Men mistake this for the new normal and dismantle their defenses. It's just novelty and relief. Enjoy it, and use those days to do the removal work from the extinction chapter, because you will not have the appetite for it later. Days 5 through 14, the cravings arrive properly, and they're worse than you remember from previous attempts. And there's a reason for that which you already know. Incubation. Cue-triggered craving climbs after cessation before it falls. This is the most misread period in the whole process. The man in week 2 concludes that quitting has made him worse, that he's more obsessed now than when he was indulging, and that the whole thing is backfiring. He's not backfiring. He's on the rising edge of a curve that turns. When it comes, you may find that the cravings are strangely unspecific. Not about a person, barely about sex. More like a generalized agitation looking for a target. That's the machine hunting for its input. Alongside it, the intrusive vividness. Old memories surfacing with unusual clarity, in detail, at inconvenient times. Faces from years ago. This is normal. It's a well-documented feature of cue-deprived craving, and it doesn't mean anything about your feelings for anyone. Your mind is reaching into the archive, because the live supply was cut. Don't interrogate the content. It's not a message. Weeks 3 through 6 is where most men quit, and where the 2 hardest phenomena arrive. The first is the flatline. The term comes from men in recovery communities, and while it isn't a clinical diagnosis, the pattern is described so consistently that it's clearly a real experience. Desire doesn't just decrease, it seems to vanish entirely, along with a lot of other feeling. Not peace, numbness, gray. The world loses saturation, motivation dips, and men frequently panic here, convinced they've broken something permanently. 2 things I can tell you. It is temporary. For most men it's some weeks, occasionally a couple of months, and it is arguably the clearest sign the process is working, because it's what a reward system looks like when it stops receiving a stimulus it had been recalibrated around. It lifts. It lifted for me. When it lifts, ordinary things, a good meal, music, sun, a conversation, come back at a volume you'd forgotten they had. I have to add one honest caution here, and it's specifically for you. If you carry a long-standing gray already, you must not assume that every low period during this is just the flat line. Withdrawal flatness is time-limited and fairly specific. Depression is a different machine with a different shape, the whole of life, not just this, and it doesn't lift on a schedule. Don't let a book about celibacy convince you that months of darkness are simply part of the protocol. That's a whole chapter later on, and it's an important one. The second phenomenon of this period is the return of the argument. Somewhere around week 4, your mind will start producing genuinely excellent reasons to stop this. Not weak rationalizations, sophisticated ones, tailored to you, arriving with the force of insight. Maybe this is unhealthy. Maybe I'm repressing. Maybe I should be balanced. Maybe I should just check once. What's happening is straightforward. A well-established behavior under extinction generates increased effort to obtain the reward. Behavioral scientists call it an extinction burst, and it happens right before the response starts to break. The arguments are the burst. Recognize them by their timing, not their content. When compelling new reasons to quit arrive in a cluster in week 4, that's the machine's last serious campaign. Months 2 and 3. The first real quiet. It comes in patches, and the first time you notice it, it's disorienting. An evening passes without the subject arising at all. You're halfway home from work before you realize you haven't thought about any of it. Men often report an odd emotional response here, something like grief or vertigo, because a thing that had been a constant companion since adolescence is intermittently absent, and you have to find out who you are in the gaps. That's real, and it passes into something more comfortable. Months 4 through 12, the scanning thins. This is the change you actually want, and it's the slowest one, because it's the most deeply grooved. It doesn't announce itself. You just notice, retrospectively, that you walked through a crowded place and didn't do the thing. Then it happens more often. By the end of the first year, most men in this life report that the automatic appraisal is dramatically reduced. Present sometimes, no longer constant, and crucially no longer costing them the afternoon. Now the failure points, specifically because forewarned is most of the battle. Alcohol. It removes the top layer of inhibition, and it is involved in a very large share of relapses. In the first 6 months, treat drinking as an unmanaged risk. Poor sleep. Sleep loss degrades exactly the prefrontal function you're relying on and amplifies reward seeking. A tired man is a different man with different rules. Protect sleep as if it were part of the protocol, because it is. Travel and disruption. New environments break the structural defenses you built at home. The hotel room at 11 at night with no routine, no gym bag by the door, nobody expecting you anywhere. Plan for it before you go. Acute loneliness and acute stress, which are the two states that most reliably reactivate the old channel, because the old channel was medicating them. This is where the pre-written, if-then list earns its keep. Not decided in the moment, decided in advance, on paper. And the false summit, the point somewhere around month 3 or 4, when a man feels genuinely fine, concludes he's cured, and reinstates a cue safely. One exposure can reinstate an extinguished response. This is well documented, and it's why the protocol doesn't relax at month 3. Finally, relapse, which I want to handle without any drama, because how you handle it determines whether it costs you a night or a year. If it happens, it is one event. It does not delete your progress, though it will feel like it does. The extinction curve is not reset to 0 by a single reinforcement, but repeated occasional reinforcement is genuinely poisonous for the reason we covered. So the rule is, treat one relapse as data, not identity. Write down the cue that fired, the time, the state you were in. Then close the loop and continue the same day. What ruins men is not the act. It's the 3-day shame spiral afterward, in which they conclude they're a fraud and abandon the whole structure. The Desert Fathers, 17 centuries ago, told their brothers to simply get up again, and they were right, and the modern evidence agrees. Shame predicts more relapse, not less. You are going to be uncomfortable for some weeks, and then it gets quiet. That's the whole of it. Not heroic, just survivable, on a known schedule. Which leaves the question of what fills the space, because a man with 2 hours a day back, and nothing to put in them, is a man who will eventually go looking for his old occupation. Chapter 9. Where the Fire Goes. There's an old claim in the retention traditions that the energy of desire, withheld, converts into creative and productive force. Napoleon Hill built a famous chapter on it. The yogic literature is full of it. And when men discover this path, that claim is usually the first thing that excites them. because it promises that the cost is actually an investment. I'm going to give you the honest version, which is less magical and more useful than either the believers or the debunkers will tell you. First, the debunking, so we're clean. There is no evidence for a literal conserved substance that converts into genius. The physiological claims, the drops of blood arithmetic, the idea that ejaculation depletes you meaningfully, the promised superhuman capacities, don't hold up. Testosterone doesn't rise permanently from abstinence. The studies people cite showed a transient bump around the end of the first week, not a sustained elevation. If you enter this expecting a biochemical upgrade, you'll be disappointed around week 6, and disappointed men quit. Now the part that's real, and it's real enough that I understand entirely why the old traditions reached for mystical language to describe it. Something does get freed. It just isn't semen. It's the 3 things that the wanting was actually consuming, and they're far more valuable than any hormone: time, attention, and drive. Time. We've counted. 2 to 3 hours a day for most men, once you include the whole apparatus. Attention is the bigger one. The scanning process, the anticipation, the checking, the mental rehearsal that consumes a percentage of working memory continuously. When it stops, you don't merely get free hours. You get a mind that can hold a single thing for a long time without slippage. Every man I know who has done this describes the same specific and startling capacity. Sustained focus on hard work of a kind they hadn't had since childhood. That's not mystical. It's what happens when a background process is terminated. And drive, this is the subtle one and where the traditions were pointing, however clumsily. Desire is not merely an appetite for sex. It's an appetite for pursuit. It's motivational energy, seeking a target. When you withdraw the target and provide no other, that energy doesn't evaporate. It circulates and gets uncomfortable, which is the restless agitation of week 3. But when you deliberately point it at something else, it goes there, at full power, and the effect can be startling. That's the true kernel inside the transmutation idea, not a fluid converting into inspiration. A motivational system that had one dominant object given a new object. Which brings us to the operative principle of this chapter, and it's the single most important practical thing in the second half of this book. You do not have a subtraction to perform. You have a substitution. Every version of this that fails the same way. A man removes the thing and leaves the space empty. Empty space doesn't stay empty. It refills with whatever is nearest, and what's nearest is the old channel and its cues. Every version that succeeds puts something demanding in the vacancy. The Desert Fathers made unbroken manual labor mandatory. The monasteries filled the day, deliberately, hour by hour, and they were explicit that idleness was the danger. Not because work is virtuous, but because an unoccupied man is a man being hunted by his own machinery. So what goes in? Let me give you criteria rather than a list, because the specific content matters less than the shape. It must be difficult. Difficulty is the whole point. It absorbs drive. Passive consumption is not a replacement. A man who quits and then watches 9 hours of television is running an empty vacancy with a screen in front of it. If it doesn't ask something of you, it won't hold the energy. It must have a progress signal. This is what the old life provided, and what men most miss without knowing it. Something that moved, that had a score, that made this month different from last month. Wanting supplied hope, and hope is just an anticipated trajectory. Whatever you install must have visible slope, weight on the bar, pages written, revenue, a language you can suddenly read, a repertoire you couldn't play last year. Without slope, the flatness in Chapter 7 becomes permanent. It must have a body component. Not optional. Physical training does specific work here. It discharges the restless agitation directly. It produces a legitimate reward on a reliable schedule. It improves sleep, which protects everything else. And it gives you a relationship with your own body that isn't about being chosen. Iron is the single most common thread among men who make this work, across every version of it I've encountered. It should have people in it. We'll come to the social chapter, but note it here. A solitary substitution is more fragile than one that puts you in rooms with other people who expect you. A team sport, a class, a workshop, a group project, anything where your absence would be noticed. Every enduring tradition of this was communal. The isolated modern version is the hardest one ever attempted, and ideally something in it serves someone else. I resisted this for a long time because it sounded like a moral instruction being smuggled in, and it isn't. It's practical. The mind that has stopped scanning has enormous free capacity, and free capacity turned inward becomes rumination. A man alone with a quiet, powerful mind and nothing outside himself to point it at will, point it at himself, and he'll take himself apart. Something with another person on the receiving end, teaching, building, caring for someone, work that lands somewhere, is the most reliable protection against that failure mode. It also happens to be what monasteries figured out. They were productive institutions, not just contemplative ones. Let me tell you how this went for me, briefly, so it isn't only theory. The first 2 months I put nothing in the space, and it was miserable. I had evenings, and I sat in them. That's when I nearly quit, and I want to be clear that it wasn't lust that nearly ended it. It was boredom, which is far more dangerous. Then I started training seriously, 5 days a week, and the agitation had somewhere to go for the first time. Then I picked up the work I'd been talking about for a decade and had never started, and the 3rd month in I noticed I had worked for 4 hours without checking anything, and had done more in that afternoon than in the previous fortnight of my old life. That was the moment this became a life rather than an abstinence, not the resistance, the redirection. 2 warnings before we move on. Don't build the replacement around impressing anyone. If the new project is secretly a longer route back to being wanted, the body, the money, the status held up for approval, you have not left the game. You've taken a detour through the gym on your way back to it. You'll know by the test of an empty room. If the achievement still satisfies with nobody watching, it's yours, and don't overschedule. Men coming off this often build a punishing regimen out of guilt about the wasted years and burnout in 8 weeks. Fill the space substantially, not totally. Leave room to be a person. Now, the body itself. Because a lot of what men fear about this path is physical, most of what they fear is wrong, and there's one real physical deficit nobody talks about that you must solve deliberately. Chapter 10. The Body Without Sex. Let's deal with the physical questions plainly, because men carry a lot of quiet anxiety here, and most of it is misplaced, while the one genuine deficit gets almost no attention at all. First, the fear that abstinence damages you. It doesn't. There's no medical requirement for sexual activity. Long-term celibate populations, monastics of various traditions, have been studied, and they are not physiologically compromised as a group. In some studies, religious monastics show longevity and health outcomes at or above the general population, which is confounded by diet, drinking, and community. But it certainly puts to rest the notion that celibacy breaks a man. You will not be injured by this. Your body is not going to punish you for it. Second, testosterone, since it comes up constantly. Abstinence does not produce a permanent hormonal upgrade. The commonly cited study showing a spike found a transient rise around the end of the first week, which then returned toward baseline. What actually moves your testosterone is unremarkable and well established. resistance training, sufficient sleep, keeping body fat in a reasonable range, adequate protein, managing chronic stress. If you want the hormonal benefits men hope to get from retention, they come from the gym and the pillow, not from the retention. Fortunately, you're doing those anyway. Third, prostate health, which some men worry about in the opposite direction. The evidence here is mixed and mostly observational. Some large cohort studies have found associations between higher ejaculation frequency and modestly lower prostate cancer risk. Others have not, and the effect sizes are small and the confounders numerous. It is not a strong enough finding to overturn a life decision, and it's worth noting that celibate monastic populations have not shown catastrophic prostate outcomes. If you have a family history, mention your situation to a doctor and get screened on the normal schedule like any other man. That's the whole of it. Don't let an uncertain association become a reason to keep a habit that was destroying your days. Fourth, nocturnal emissions. They'll happen, especially in the first months, and then typically become infrequent. They are not relapses, they are not failures, and they require no response beyond changing the sheets. There's a strain of the old traditions that treated these as spiritual catastrophes and generated enormous, unnecessary anguish. Ignore that entirely. Your body is managing itself. Fifth, erectile function, because men fear a use-it-or-lose-it effect. Spontaneous nocturnal erections continue regardless of activity, which is the relevant physiological maintenance. Men who've been celibate for years and later chose to stop generally report normal function. Nothing atrophies from disuse in the way men imagine. If anything, men coming off heavy pornography frequently report improvements, which makes sense given the recalibration involved. So that's the reassurance, and it's mostly complete. Now the real deficit, the one I promised, and I want you to take it as seriously as anything in this book: touch. Human beings need physical contact. This isn't sentimentality. There's a specific class of nerve fibers in the skin, C-tactile afferents, that respond preferentially to slow, gentle stroking at around skin temperature, and they project to brain regions involved in emotional processing rather than to the ordinary touch mapping areas. We are wired with a dedicated channel for affectionate contact. Deprivation of it is associated with poorer sleep, higher anxiety, elevated stress markers, and a diffuse dysphoria that people are notoriously bad at identifying the source of. Here is the trap, and it's specific to men in modern Western-influenced cultures. For most adult men, virtually all of their affectionate touch arrives through a romantic partner. Male friendship in these cultures has been stripped of physical contact almost entirely. Family touch tapers off after childhood. So when a man removes the romantic channel, he doesn't reduce his touch. He goes to approximately zero and can stay there for years, and then he misattributes it. This is the important part. Months into this life, he feels an ache, and the mind, which explains its own states with whatever story is available, tells him it's about a woman. He decides the celibacy has failed, that he's lonely for a partner, that he's suppressing his nature. Very often what's actually happening is a straightforward touch deficit in a nervous system built for contact, and it can be addressed without abandoning anything. So address it deliberately, concretely. Regular therapeutic massage. This is the single most efficient solution, professional, boundaried, entirely non-sexual, and it delivers exactly the kind of sustained skin contact the system is asking for. Twice a month if you can afford it. If money's tight, physiotherapy or a sports massage after training serves a similar function while also being useful. Physical practices with contact built in. Grappling sports, wrestling, judo, jiu-jitsu are extraordinary for this, and men rarely realize why they leave those gyms feeling settled. Hours of close physical contact with other human beings, entirely non-sexual, in a structured and companionable setting. It solves touch, exercise, community, and progress signals simultaneously, which makes it about the highest leverage single activity available to a man on this path. Recalibrate your own physical warmth with the people you already have. Embrace your family properly rather than the stiff pat. Hug your friends when you greet them. It will feel awkward for a few months if you weren't raised that way. And then it will feel normal, and it's a real supply line. An animal, if your circumstances allow it. Not a joke. Daily physical contact with a dog or cat is well documented as stress-reducing, and it provides warmth and routine and something that requires care from you. A great many solitary men in this life keep animals, and it's not an accident. Beyond touch, a few more physical notes worth having. Sleep is not a lifestyle preference on this path. It's structural. Sleep deprivation degrades exactly the executive function you rely on and amplifies reward seeking, which is to say, a tired you is a version of you with weaker defenses and stronger cravings. Most relapses happen late at night in a tired body. Guard sleep like part of the protocol, and note that the phone out of the bedroom rule serves both purposes at once. Train hard and train for something. The agitation of the early months has to go somewhere physical, and the reliable, progressive reward of lifting or running is one of the few honest substitutes for the reward you removed. Cardio has the additional benefit of directly reducing the restlessness. Eat like an adult and moderate alcohol severely, at least for the first 6 months. Alcohol is the single most common proximate cause of relapse, for obvious mechanical reasons. And get sunlight and get outside daily, which sounds like filler advice until you've spent a winter in a small flat with a quiet mind and understood how narrow a life can become without it. One last thing on the body, and it's about self-concept rather than physiology. For 20 years, your body's value was probably measured in your own mind by whether it got chosen. That's a brutal way to live inside a body, and it's one of the underappreciated cruelties of the whole arrangement. When you leave the market, your body becomes available for a different relationship, as an instrument rather than an advertisement. What can it do? What can it carry? How far can it run? How well does it work at 50? Men on this path frequently end up in far better physical condition than they were in during their pursuing years, and the reason isn't extra discipline. It's that the training stopped being an audition and became maintenance of the only vehicle they get. That's the body handled, which leaves the hardest practical problem in this life, and it isn't lust, and it isn't loneliness. It's other people, and what you're going to tell them. Chapter 11. The Gray. I need to stop and talk about something that isn't celibacy, because if I don't, this book will quietly lie to you by omission, and the lie would cost you years. You told me, or if you didn't, a great many men holding this book would, that you've lived a long time in a low gray. 2 decades, maybe. Not agony. Not a crisis anyone would notice from outside. Just a persistent flatness where nothing has much color, where things that should matter don't, where you're functional and hollow at once, and where the phrase permanent depression doesn't feel dramatic to you, it just feels descriptive. And you've reasoned that the rejection is what causes it, so removing the rejection should remove the gray. I have to tell you honestly, partly, and not entirely, and the distinction matters more than almost anything else in this book. Here's the true part, and it's substantial. There is a specific pain that comes from entering a market where you keep losing. It's sharp, it's dated, it attaches to particular events. A message that dies, a conversation that thins out, a Saturday that turns to ash at 5:21 in the afternoon. That pain is real. This path genuinely ends it, and ending it is not a small thing. 20 years of accumulating small humiliations stops accumulating. The days that used to get destroyed stop getting destroyed. I know that relief, and I would not trade it back. Now the part one won't soften. That's one source of pain, and the gray you're describing is a different machine. Learn to tell them apart, because they respond to completely different interventions. The rejection wound is event-shaped. Something happens, you hurt, it fades, and crucially, it is domain-specific. The rest of your life still has flavor. Depression is not event-shaped, and it isn't domain-specific. It's weather rather than climate events. It flattens the things that have nothing to do with women. Food, music, work you used to like, friends, mornings. It brings the physical signature. Sleep that's wrong in one direction or the other. Appetite off. Fatigue that rest doesn't fix. Concentration that slides. It brings the characteristic thoughts, the ones that feel like clear-eyed realism rather than symptoms. Nothing will change. This is simply what I am. There's no point starting. That last one is why this chapter exists. The cruelest property of the thing is that it presents its own conclusions as insight. It doesn't announce itself as an illness distorting your judgment. It announces itself as the truth finally seen clearly. Which means a man can spend 20 years in it entirely convinced he's simply a realist about his own worthlessness, and never once consider that the lens itself is bent. So here's the honest arithmetic about what this path can and cannot do for you. Celibacy removes an input. If a meaningful portion of your suffering is being generated by repeated participation in something that keeps wounding you, taking that away produces a real improvement, and you will feel it within months. That's genuine, and I'm not underselling it. But celibacy is not a treatment for depression. It doesn't act on the mechanism. And there's a specific danger I want you to see clearly, because I've watched it happen. A man in the gray adopts this path, feels the relief of the removed wound, attributes his remaining flatness to the withdrawal phase, and then keeps attributing it to the withdrawal phase for a year, 2 years, 5. The framework gives him a permanent explanation for a condition that was never about this at all, and the explanation is what keeps him from ever getting the actual thing looked at. The book he read becomes the reason he never gets treated. Don't let this be that book. So, if 6 months in the sharp pain is gone, but the gray is unchanged, that's your answer. The gray was never about women. It's its own thing, and it's treatable, and the treatments work for a great many people who were certain nothing would work for them, which is itself one of the symptoms rather than a fact about the world. 20 years is not evidence that nothing helps. It's usually evidence that nothing was tried, because the condition argued convincingly against trying. I'll say the practical part once and then leave it alone. Talk to a doctor. Not a forum, not a book, not me. It's an unremarkable conversation, and it is the single highest leverage thing available to a man who has been flat for 2 decades. The interventions that have evidence behind them for this, talking therapies of the structured kind, medication where appropriate, and yes, the boring physical inputs, exercise, sleep, sunlight, not drinking, are worth more than any philosophy, including this one. Now let me put this in the frame of the book, because I don't want it to read as a detour or as me talking you out of your own plan. I'm not. Everything else in these pages stands. But there's a structural point about the whole path that this chapter forces, and it's important. This life is a subtraction, and subtractions don't add anything. You are removing a machine that generates pain. That's valuable. But a man with less pain and nothing else is not a man with a life. He's a man in a quieter room. Every part of this book that talks about substitution, about slope, about the body, about other people, is there because subtraction alone leaves you with vacancy, and vacancy is exactly where the gray does its best work. A hollow, quiet, solitary life is the ideal environment for it. That's not an argument against celibacy. It's an argument that celibacy has to be half of a plan, and the other half is construction. And there's one more thing that belongs here, said carefully. Watch how you talk to yourself about all this. You told me you'd be willing to build hatred to escape the pull, and I said no on engineering grounds. Here's the part. One didn't say then. Contempt is not a stable thing that stays aimed where you point it, and a mind already prone to the gray does not need a new skill in disgust. It will turn that skill on its owner, reliably, at 3 in the morning. If there's one interaction between this path and your existing condition that I'd flag above all others, it's that one. Indifference toward the whole subject is a light burden. Cultivated bitterness is a heavy one, and you're already carrying enough weight. Let me end with the honest hope, because I don't want this chapter to land as a warning and nothing else. The improvement I got from this path was real, and it was larger than I expected. The days that used to get destroyed stopped getting destroyed. The 2 in the morning got quiet. The self-inflicted portion of my suffering, and there was a substantial self-inflicted portion, though I couldn't see it while I was inside it, simply went away, and what was left was much more manageable than what I'd had before. But I want you to have the whole thing, not just the manageable part. So take the relief this offers, take all of it, build the second half of the plan, and get the other machine looked at by someone qualified. Those are not competing options. Do both, and you'll have given yourself a genuine chance at something better than quiet. Now, back to the practical world, and to the problem that will bother you far more often than lust does: everyone else. Chapter 12. Everyone else. Lust is not going to be your main problem. I want to say that clearly, because men prepare for the wrong war. After the first few months, desire becomes a manageable weather system. What doesn't become manageable on its own, what will bother you at year 1 and year 5 and year 10, is other people, and the fact that you have chosen something for which our culture has no respectable category. So this chapter is the social manual: what to say, what not to say, and how to hold a position for decades without either isolating yourself or turning bitter. Start with a strategic principle, because it governs everything else. You are not obligated to explain your life, and explaining it usually makes things worse. Men get this backwards. They believe that if they can articulate the reasoning well enough, people will understand, and the pressure will stop. It won't. What you're proposing sits outside most people's map, and a long explanation invites debate. It frames your life as a proposition to be evaluated rather than a fact about you. The more you argue for it, the more you signal that it's up for argument, and the more energy you'll spend defending something that requires no defense. The technique is a short, calm, boring answer that closes the topic without hostility. Boring is the operative word. Curiosity feeds on drama, and a flat answer starves it. Let me give you the actual lines, graded by how much you owe the person. To colleagues and acquaintances, people owed nothing. I'm not dating. That's it. Full stop, pleasant tone, then change the subject or ask them something about themselves. If pressed, it's just not a priority for me right now. Nobody escalates past that twice unless they're rude, And if they're rude, the answer is a smile and a subject change. Notice what these lines don't contain. No philosophy, no cause, no wound. Nothing to grab. To friends who genuinely care, people owed something. A bit more, still short. I've stepped back from all of it. It was eating my life, and I'm much better without it. That's honest. It's positive rather than defensive. And it frames the decision as gain rather than deprivation, which stops the conversation from becoming an intervention. Most friends will accept this and move on, and the ones who keep pushing usually settle within a year once they see you're not miserable. To family, which is the hard one, especially where marriage carries real cultural weight. This is a war of attrition, not a single conversation, and the goal is not to win the argument, it's to become boring on the topic. Same answer every time, delivered warmly, never escalating, never defending. It's not for me. I know you'd like that. It's not going to happen. No new material, no philosophy, no debate. Pressure needs traction, and a man who says the same calm thing for 3 years provides none. If your family is the kind that requires a more legible frame, you're allowed to give them one. I've decided to live like this. I'm content. You don't owe anyone your internal history. You especially don't owe them the story about the rejections. Now, some specific situations, because they arrive predictably. The setup attempt. Someone has a cousin, a colleague, a friend. Decline early and clearly. I appreciate it, but I'm not dating at all. Don't take the meeting to be polite. A single polite meeting resets the whole thing and generates 6 months of follow-up. The "are you gay" question, which will arrive, sometimes kindly, sometimes not. Answer it plainly and without heat, whatever the truth is, and then the boring line. Getting agitated makes it a topic. It isn't one. The "you're going to regret this" speech, usually from an older relative, sometimes delivered with real love. Here's the thing, they might be right, and you can concede that without conceding the decision. Maybe. It's what I'm doing. That's an unanswerable response, because it doesn't claim certainty and doesn't yield ground. Men lose this exchange by overclaiming, insisting they'll never change their mind, which invites the other person to test it. Weddings, which are the recurring tax. You'll be seated at the singles table, asked the question a dozen times in one afternoon, and watched with sympathy. The pragmatic advice, go, be genuinely happy for them, have your boring line ready, and give yourself permission to leave early. Also, take on a job. Help with something, hold something, run something. A man with a task is not a man being pitied. The mockery from other men, which stings more than most men admit. Some of it comes from discomfort. You're not participating in the thing they organize their identity around, and that reads as an implicit judgment even when you've made none. Do not defend, and above all do not counterattack by disparaging their lives. The moment you say anything about how they're slaves to it, you've become the tedious convert, and you've confirmed that your choice needs their inferiority to feel stable. It doesn't. Let it pass. Men stop mocking things that don't flinch. Now the two hardest ones. First, the woman who shows genuine interest, some months or years in. It will happen, and it will be more destabilizing than any craving, because it arrives with warmth and it makes the whole structure feel like a mistake. Understand what's happening mechanically. You remove the pursuit, but the reward system still recognizes the signal. An unexpected reward is the most powerful configuration there is. Handle it with kindness and clarity. In that order. She hasn't done anything wrong, and she deserves a straight, warm, non-dramatic answer. I'm not available for that, but I've enjoyed knowing you. Don't punish her for triggering you. Don't lecture her about your path. And don't keep her half engaged as an ego supply. That's the old game running under a new name, and it's the most common way this life quietly ends. Second, the isolation, which is the actual mortal risk of this path and has nothing to do with sex. Here's the structural problem. In modern life, adult friendship is largely maintained by institutions, work and coupling, and children. Your peers will pair off through their 30s, and their availability will collapse. That happens to everyone. But most men have a partner and eventually a household absorbing that loss. You won't. So unless you act deliberately, your social world will narrow year by year until you're a man alone in a flat with a quiet mind, and I've told you what the gray does with vacancy. Every enduring tradition of this life understood the problem and solved it the same way: community, built in on purpose. The desert had elders and brothers. Monasteries had a shared table and a shared schedule. The isolated modern celibate is attempting the version with the support structure removed, and it's the version that fails. So build it deliberately and treat this as part of the protocol rather than optional social life. Recurring, scheduled in-person commitments where your absence is noticed. That last clause is the whole thing. A training gym you attend on fixed days. A team. A class that runs for months. A volunteer commitment with a rota. Anything where people expect you and would ask where you were. Friendships maintained by initiation, which means you are the one who calls and organizes, permanently, without keeping score. Men who wait to be invited disappear. And ideally something intergenerational. Coaching, mentoring, teaching, helping with someone's kids, because the years pass, and a man with only same-age peers gets lonelier as they get busier. One last piece, and it's the one I'd most want you to hold on to over the long run. The strongest social position available to you isn't a good explanation. It's evident contentment. Nobody argues for long with a man who is visibly fine. The pressure, the mockery, the concern, nearly all of it is a response to the assumption that you're suffering and in denial. When people watch you over years and see someone calm, occupied, physically well, engaged with his work, generous with his time, and not obviously carrying a wound, the questions taper off on their own. They ran out for me somewhere in the 3rd year, not because I wanted debate, because there was nothing to worry about. And that's the whole thing, really. This only works as a life you're actually living, not as a position you're holding, which is why the last thing I owe you is the practical program, what to actually do, in what order, starting tomorrow. Chapter 13. The 90-Day Protocol. Everything up to here has been understanding. Understanding changes nothing on its own. I understood my own machinery for years while running it nightly. This chapter is what you actually do, in order, with dates on it. Follow it as written. The parts you'll want to skip are the load-bearing ones, which is always how this goes. One instruction before we start: do the removal work in a calm state, in daylight this week, not at 11 at night when you're resolved and agitated. Structural changes made by a calm man in the morning are the ones that hold. Days 1 to 3, the removal. This is the highest leverage work in the entire program, and it takes about 2 hours. Buy a physical alarm clock. Tonight the phone charges in another room. Permanently. This one change removes the 2 worst hours of your day, the last hour awake and the first hour conscious, and it does more than any amount of resolve. Delete every app whose real function is women, all of them, including the one you keep for a reason you've constructed. Then sanitize the feeds. Unfollow, mute, and block until your scroll is genuinely clear of the material, and if an algorithm keeps serving it after a week of that, delete the account. You are not obligated to keep a service that is working against you. Install content blocking at the strongest level. You can manage device level and network level if you're able. Set it up now while you're calm and make the password inconvenient to retrieve. Then write your cue inventory on paper. Every trigger you can identify, times of day, rooms, chairs, routes, apps, sounds, moods, the specific shape of an empty Sunday. Be exhaustive. You'll find 20 or 30. Beside each one, either remove it or write the if-then replacement. This document is the actual program. Keep it on paper. Somewhere you'll see it. Days 1 to 7. The substitutions get scheduled, not intended. Book them like appointments, because vague plans die. Physical training, 4 days a week, on named days, with the bag packed the night before. Lifting if possible for the progress signal. Something is infinitely better than nothing. A daily walk of at least 20 minutes with no phone, ideally in the evening, at the hour that used to be dangerous. This one drill is worth more than it looks. It converts your worst hour into a routine. One demanding project, chosen this week, with a visible measure of progress. The thing you've been talking about for a decade. 90 minutes a day, protected, scheduled. It doesn't matter if you choose imperfectly. It matters that the vacancy has something difficult in it by day 7. Sleep on a fixed schedule, 8 hours in bed, same time. Non-negotiable. This is defense, not wellness. Alcohol. None for the first 90 days. It's the most common proximate cause of relapse, and there's no version of this where drinking through the hardest phase makes sense. Week 2 onward, the daily practice. 5 things, and they take almost no time. The urge drill, whenever a craving fires. Do not suppress and do not argue. Locate it in the body, watch it rise, watch it fall, keep your hands busy. It'll take a few minutes. You're teaching yourself, rep by rep, that the wave has no power to move you. The if-then list, obeyed literally. When the trigger fires, you execute the pre-written action without a debate. The decision was made in daylight by a clearer man. Your job at 11 at night is compliance, not deliberation. 90 seconds of hands. Practically, when the cue hits, the first 90 seconds decide the hour. Stand up. Leave the room. Cold water on the face. Shoes on. Outside. It's crude, and it works, because it interrupts the cue response chain before the negotiating starts. One line in a log. Daily. Date. Any cue that fired hard. What you did. Hours slept. Whether you trained. 2 sentences maximum. This isn't journaling. It's instrumentation. And in month 2, you'll be able to see your own patterns in it, which is worth more than any theory. And a weekly review, 10 minutes, Sunday, read the week's lines, note which cue is still costing you the most, and fix that one structurally rather than resolving to be stronger. Weeks 2 to 6, the hard stretch, and here's the calendar so it doesn't surprise you. Cravings climb before they fall. Expect the worst around weeks 2 to 4. The flatline may arrive. Gray, unmotivated, desire simply absent. It's temporary. And around week 4, expect the extinction burst. A cluster of unusually persuasive arguments for quitting the whole project, arriving with the force of insight. Recognize them by their timing, not their content. Do not renegotiate the protocol during weeks 2 to 6. Any change to the rules gets deferred to day 90. That single policy will save you. Months 2 and 3. The first quiet arrives in patches, and the work shifts from removal to construction. Add the social structure now, the recurring, scheduled, in-person commitment where your absence will be noticed. Grappling gym, team, class, volunteer rota. Also, start the touch solution deliberately. Massage twice a month, or a contact sport, or both. Do not treat these as optional extras. They are the 2 failure modes with the highest body count. Day 90, the review, and this is where you decide the shape of the long run. Read your log from the start. Answer honestly on paper. How many hours a day came back? What did I actually build? Is the sharp pain gone? Is the scanning reduced? What am I doing with evenings? And the question from the gray chapter, is my flatness lifting, or is it unchanged? In which case, that was never about this, and it's time to see a doctor. Then the long arc, briefly, because 90 days is a start and not a life. Months 4 to 12, the scanning thins, unevenly. Keep the structure, the phone rule, the blocks, the training, the log, weekly review. Deepen the project so it has a real horizon, a year out, a skill, a body of work. Add a second social commitment because the first one will eventually end. Watch the 2 specific hazards: travel, which strips your defenses, and the false summit at month 3 or 4 when you feel cured and reinstate a cue safely. One exposure can bring the whole response back. That's mechanism, not superstition. Year 1 to 3. This stops being a protocol and becomes how you live. The rules become invisible, the way a man who doesn't drink doesn't think about not drinking. Expect a hard patch somewhere in the 2nd year, usually triggered by a life event. A loss, a friend's wedding, an illness, a stretch of loneliness. The protocol is the same as day 1. Cue removal replacement, the wave. And now the exit clause, which is the mark of a discipline rather than a cage, and I mean every word of it. You are allowed to change your mind. This is a chosen life, and its legitimacy comes entirely from the choosing. Enforced celibacy is a different and far worse thing, historically catastrophic. And a man who has locked himself in without an exit is running the bad version. So here's the rule I'd ask you to follow. Any decision to end this gets made in daylight, sober, at least 7 days after the impulse arrives, on paper, with a reason you can write down, not at 11 at night in an agitated body. If in a year you find you want children, or you meet someone and want a life with them, or you simply conclude that this was a season rather than a destination, that's not failure, and it doesn't retroactively invalidate anything. You'll re-enter with an intact attention span, a trained body, real work, and no compulsion, which is a vastly better position than the one you left from. The only decision I'd ask you to make firmly is the one about the next 90 days, because a path renegotiated nightly isn't a path. And that's the program. 2 hours of setup, 5 daily practices, 1 weekly review, a known curve, and an honest door out. What I can't put in a protocol is what it's actually like on the other side, which is the last thing I have to give you and the reason I wrote all of this down. Chapter 14. The Quiet. I want to tell you about an ordinary Tuesday, because the honest ending of this book isn't triumphant, and I'd be lying if I dressed it up. I woke up before the alarm. The physical one on the dresser, 3 years old now. The first thought in my head was about a problem in the work I'd left the night before, and I lay there for a minute turning it over. That's it. That's the whole event, and it's the thing I most want you to understand. Because for 20 years, the first conscious act of every single day was a check and a small deflation, and now the first thing that arrives is whatever I was thinking about when I stopped. I trained, I worked for a long stretch, without slippage. In the afternoon, I walked through a crowded part of the city, and I want to be precise about this, because it's the thing you asked me for. Women passed me. And I noticed some of them, the way you notice a well-made building or a striking sky, and it cost me nothing. Nothing followed. No spiral, no story, no rehearsal, no wondering. The observation arrived and left, and the afternoon continued. 20-year-old me would not have believed such a state was available to a heterosexual man. It's not that I've become something else. It's that the enormous apparatus which used to convert a glance into an hour has been dismantled, and what's left is just the glance. In the evening I had dinner with friends, and I was entirely there for it. Then I read for an hour, and the reading went all the way down, the way it did when I was a boy before the checking. And I went to bed and slept. That's it. That's the promised land, an ordinary Tuesday that belonged to me from end to end. I know that isn't cinematic. Nobody makes a film out of it. But hold it against the Tuesday I described in Chapter 1. The scanning through a funeral, the evenings hollowed out, the one in the morning, the day destroyed at 5:21 in the afternoon by a stranger's silence. And you'll see why I would not go back for anything I can think of. Let me be honest about what didn't happen, though, because I promised you no overselling. I did not become a different species. The machinery is quieter, not absent. There are still days, usually when I've slept badly or something has gone wrong, when the old channel opens for a while and I feel it. It passes. It costs me a few minutes instead of a decade. Extinction isn't erasure. I did not become happy by subtraction. This is the most important thing in the chapter. Removing the wanting removed a great deal of suffering, and it created a vacancy, and the vacancy was neutral. It became good only because I put a life in it. The training, the work, the people who expect me on Thursdays, the person I teach, the animal that needs walking, the thing I'm building that's bigger than a year. Take those out, and I'd have been a man in a quiet flat with nothing pulling at him and nothing holding him up, which is not freedom, it's just silence. If you take one sentence out of this whole book, take that one, and I did not escape being human. I still get lonely, less than I did while chasing, which surprised everyone, including me, but it happens. There are evenings when I'd like someone to be there when I get home. I've stopped treating that as evidence that I chose wrong. It's just a price on the receipt, and I read the receipt before I paid. Now let me say something to the man who came here through the door I came through. You told me you'd been in the gray a long time, and that this felt like the last option. Either the flat forever, or shut the whole thing off. I understood that completely, and I didn't argue with your reasons, and I want to end by being honest about what I think actually happened to me, in case it's useful. The relief was real. Enormous, actually. The specific pain, the sharp one, the dated one, the 521 kind, stopped occurring, and it has not returned because I stopped standing in the place where it happens. 20 years of small humiliations stopped accumulating. That much this path delivered exactly as advertised. But the gray did not lift because of this. I want you to hear that plainly from the one person in this book who has no reason to sell you anything. What lifted the gray was a separate piece of work, done by people who knew what they were doing, that I put off for far too long because the condition itself kept telling me there was no point. Two things at once. I stopped feeding the fire, and I got the other thing treated. Either alone would have left me half-finished. I don't know which of them mattered more, and I suspect the question is meaningless. But I know that if I'd only done the celibacy, I'd have ended up a calmer man in a gray room, and I'd have called that freedom because I wouldn't have known what else to call it. So take everything in this book. It works. All of it. And it will give you back hours and evenings and a mind that isn't scanning. And then go and get the other machine looked at, so that when the quiet arrives you can actually feel it. One last thing, and then I'll leave you to it. Somewhere around the second year, I stopped thinking of myself as a man who had given something up. That's the strangest part of this, and the hardest to convey to anyone standing on the other side of it. From out there, this looks like an amputation. A man renouncing, abstaining, going without. From in here, it doesn't feel like going without anything. It feels like having put down something heavy that I'd been carrying so long. I'd stopped noticing the weight, and only understood how heavy it was by how light I felt without it. You will not be a lesser man for this. You will be a man with his time back, his attention back, his evenings back, and his dignity no longer subject to anyone else's thumb. Whatever the reason you came, however unheroic, however tired, however much it was, simply that you couldn't take another year of it. The hours are still yours, the scanning still stops, the 2 in the morning still gets quiet. Nobody is going to applaud. There's no ceremony for this, and no one will ever know what it cost you. But you'll wake up on an ordinary Tuesday, and the first thought in your head will be your own, and you'll walk through a crowded street and feel nothing pull at you, and you'll go to bed having spent the whole day inside your own life. That's what's on the other side. It's quiet, it's yours. Go and take it.